What's up, Scyushi Squad? We are back in this more Trove, and today we're going to be talking about the Solarion. Yes, that's right. It turns out that this entire time, I never ended up making an updated guide to the Solarion. The last videos I checked on the channel, you guys let me know about this in the comments and stuff, and I checked on the channel, and lo and behold, the videos that I have highlighting the Solarion was from like the test server. I never ended up making updated guides when it ended up going live, which is hilarious because this is the highest damage dealing character in the entire game, and I should draw attention to that so that you guys know how you build this character and just what a god it can end up being. Now, before we end up getting into the nitty-gritty of all the build and stuff like that, I wanted to give a quick summary of how you're going to end up playing this guy, its strengths and its weaknesses. Now, obviously, the whole class is centralized around damage over time, or DOT, as us nerd gamers refer to it, right? And so you can see all of them slowly going on top of this target right here. So as long as I'm tagging this thing with my base attack, it's going to constantly refresh all of those damage over times. And then if I end up using my ult, it's going to end up dealing additional damage on top of it and expending a lot of the dots, which a lot of this just has, the club world is very broken, so a lot of my projectiles don't even shoot out of my character. So not to mention the training dummies themselves are busted. I would have to basically destroy this and put it back on the ground so that the training dummy would fix the amount of damage that it shows, because otherwise it's just broken. I'm just saying that so that you guys know, okay? I also don't have ideal stats on this guy because I have all of my good gems on my Shadow Hunter, as we'll highlight later in the video. But in terms of the strengths of this character, you know, Leviathans, you're going to be able to solo no problem, at least when you're at the end game. This character is just an absolute monster of a unit in terms of damage, and then you are also going to be able to do deep delves, because that's, you know, those things just go hand in hand with one another. If you can end up handling Leviathans, you can handle delves, and if you can handle delves, you can handle Leviathans. Not always. It's not always the case, because obviously survivability is going to end up being a bit of a problem, but the Solarion is one of those classes where it just hits so hard that you don't really need that much survivability, because everything that you're fighting is dead before it can hurt you, right? Now, the weakness of the class is the movement speed. That's the one thing that is severely lacking on this class. It doesn't really have anything to help it move faster from point A to point B. And so while you will be able to absolutely decimate dungeon bosses in U11 and U9, U10, so on and so forth, the speed with which you travel from dungeon to dungeon is going to be severely lacking. And a lot of other characters are going to be higher on the tier list of a speed farming character. So just keep that in mind. Now, without further ado, let's talk about how you're going to end up building this guy. So first and foremost, let's talk about the subclass ability, just because we're going to go from top to bottom. Subclass ability, there's a lot of different options you can use. I more recently have been trying out the Shadow Hunter one because it seems to be pretty dang good on this guy. But are you going to end up using it? No, you're not. You're going to end up using Sword of Crazy. The Lunar Lancer subclass ability is going to be basically the best for damage dealing, just because it's going to end up not only giving you the extra physical damage, because yes, this is a physical damage based class, but it's also going to end up making it so that you will randomly turn into lunacy mode, which will give you attack speed and extra damage. And attack speed is one of the mandatory things that you want on this guy. Now, speaking of the stats that you're going for on your gear, you are going for attack speed as a priority, and then your sub stat or second stat would end up being crit damage if you need the damage, and if you're trying to fight like deep delves and Leviathans and stuff, you want to end up having as much damage as possible. However, if you're actually actively using this class for like normal farming, and you don't want to end up wanting to Alt F4 and uninstall the game, you're going to want to have the second stat be movement speed, just for the sake of having anything that'll end up helping you out in terms of farm speed, right? Now, that said, I would also end up pairing the subclass ability of the Knight when you're doing your farming stuff. It just might not be something that you want to necessarily go for when you're doing like Delves and Leviathans. Now, for me and my money, I would always just end up using the Knight subclass, because I like having the extra flask capacity on top of the mount movement speed being nice and consistent. But anyways, let's move on to the banner that you're going to be going for. Obviously, there are quite a few options. The Nitro banner is going to be probably your cheapest option, but then otherwise you're going to be going for the Leviathan torches. So when you defeat a Leviathan, you will end up getting a daily torch, which expires on the daily reset. You can combine 3 of those into a weekly torch, which expires on the weekly reset. And then very, very rarely you can get what we refer to as a permatorch, which is a permanent torch. Very, very rare drop. That is a torch that will never expire. It never goes away. And you can actually forge those torches into other torches, like this one right here, that has very, very specific stats. And I always just go for the ones that have the movement speed, because I was fortunate enough to get quite a few permatorches after I got my first permatorch. But it took a lot of Leviathans in order to end up getting that. There is always going to end up being the option, ever since the Sunrise update though, where there is a Leviathan badge. For defeating 250 Leviathans, you will get a free permanent torch, which honestly, if you get a permatorch before you kill 250 Leviathans, consider yourself lucky, because the drop rate of these permatorches is really, really bad. So anyways, let's move on to the allies. So the allies, you have a couple options. Generally speaking, Paragon allies are going to be your best bet. Ernie, more specifically, is going to be the most powerful physical-based ally in the game, just because it gives you the extra light, also gives you the extra physical damage, although there are some other options within the Paragon set. Not really. And then for the Delves allies, you could end up using Jingles. You could use the animated Jug. That's probably the one that I would use just because of the movement speed, but Jingles is really good because of the cooldown reduction, which means that you could end up using your abilities more often. And then of course, you know, you could use Raptor Berserker or so on and so forth if you want other physical allies, but you know, that's getting a little bit too low in the tier list, right? Like if you're using the Solarion, chances are you're pretty good at the game, or you spent money, because let's face it, this class is, it's hard to get. It really is. So moving on to the hidden ring effect. So the hidden ring effect, there is only one option, and that's going to end up being the prismatic chain. The other ones are, you know, the guiding flight makes it so that you end up getting slow fall with all your abilities. Useless. And then Solar Stance basically gives you a damage reduction buff on your character for a short time. Useless. So the prismatic chain makes it so that prismatic blast, which is your ultimate, causes enemies damaged by it to also fire off prismatic blast. So it basically causes a huge chain reaction of explosion upon explosion upon explosion. Top that with the fact that the class gem ability of the character makes it so that your ultimate ability will now have a pulse of damage around your Phoenix ally as well. And suddenly you start seeing how this can end up just causing a huge chongo bongo chain reaction, because if I use my ult, you can see my little ally gets the ult pulse around it as well. And if there was other enemies around and I had the hidden ring effect, well, yeah, everything would die. Then there's going to end up being the Flask. So I always just use Death Defying. You know, pick your poison, use whatever flask that you want, but generally speaking, if you're at the end game, and unless you have like fully maxed out crystal gems to the point where you can actually start getting yourself some max health, which is very, very difficult to get, everything in the game is gonna one-shot you. That's just the name of the game. That's just how Trove is. And so Death Defying is always going to end up being the must-have. But if you want to argue different, and if you want to end up picking different flasks, be my guest. So the emblem, you're going to end up going for Martial Emblem. That's going to end up being a must because of the way that the enemies just keep scaling now that we've got, you know, U11 and stuff like that. But the sub emblem that you're going to be going for is going to change depending on where you are in the game. If you can sacrifice it, Sure Strike is going to be your starting emblem, more than likely, just because your crit hit's going to be a little bit low. And then if you can get rid of that, you could use Chromatic, you could use Unyielding, you could use Trailblazing. Trailblazing is the one that I just kind of always use as a standard, just because, once again, the lacking piece of the puzzle with this character is going to end up being the movement speed. Oh, and then I guess I should say, before we end up moving on to the stats, because everyone always yells at me about food items don't matter. I mean, just take whatever food gives you the most extra light. That's all there really is to it. It doesn't make as much of a difference as people pretend it does. I mean, it does, but it doesn't. So the stats that you're going to be aiming for, what I'm going to be sharing with you guys is most of all a mid to end game idea. Okay, so it's not like you have to hit these numbers specifically. Trove doesn't really work that way. You know, an arbitrary number doesn't really make that much of a difference in this game because Trove is not complicated, which is actually why I like this game so much, because I feel it's very approachable, because you pretty much just use the same build for every character, and having higher damage makes it so that you are more powerful. Go figure. But my point is that there's no set items, there's no combination of different abilities that you can end up using that would make, oh, my Solarion damage over time build. No, you just use a standard DPS build. But anyways, your physical damage, I'd say you have to get at least at like 80,000 to 100,000 at the base value, not including bonuses. And anything higher than that obviously is going to end up being very nice. Same for your crit hit, you're going to be aiming for 70% and up, just because when you're at 70% or even 60%, Sure Strike is going to be a helpful tool to end up giving you more, you know, crit hit to end up helping you get to that sweet 100%. But ultimately, your goal is to get to 100% crit hit. And then the crit damage, you're going to be aiming for, let's say 800% and up. Again, anything higher than that is always going to end up being highly valued. And that's where you can compensate by getting movement speed off of your gear and swapping it instead for crit damage and so on and so forth. You know, these are just kind of base number values for you guys to kind of work towards. If you find that one area is lacking, you kind of just take those numbers and build upon that. Now, speaking of building upon, let's talk about the gems. So I'm going to swap to my Shadow Hunter, but keep in mind that these are the same gems that I would end up using on my Solarion, just because I only have one set of good physical gems. Now, for the Cosmic Gem, the Empowered Gem more specifically, you're going to be going for Berserk Battler. Vampirium is a really good one just because it gives you survivability, it gives you movement speed, yes, but Berserk Battler is going to end up giving you more damage, which is of course where the Solarion shines. So that's the gem type that you're focusing on. And then you want to end up making sure that all of your Cosmic Gems, your Lesser and your Big Boy Gem, are going to end up having all pearls light, and then no pearls into physical or crit damage as the other stat values on it. Now, moving on to the other colored Empowered Gems, these, you have a couple options. Generally speaking, your best bet is going to be Pyrodisc for the movement speed and Explosive Apolog for that sweet bit of extra damage. You can use Cubic Curtain if you need to for survivability. And lots of people have been asking about Volatile Velocity. Volatile Velocity basically increases your ranged attack range by about 40%. And is really, really good on the Shadow Hunter because of the fact that the Shadow Hunter can shoot through walls. I wouldn't really find it to be too useful on the Solarion unless you really want to play at a distance and shoot things from afar. But generally, you can swap out Volatile for something like Explosive Epilogue just because of the extra damage that you would get from it, or whatever you want. But Pyrodisc is the only one that I would say is kind of a mandatory because, once again, the lacking factor of the Solarion is the movement speed. Now, as far as the pearls that you go for on all of your Empowered Gems, you know, take this with a grain of salt, because if you have these pearls slightly changed, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't make that much of a difference, okay? But generally speaking, you're going to be aiming for 2 pearls physical damage, 1 pearl crit damage, and no pearls in crit hit until you have enough crit hit value that you could then sacrifice it on your gems for max health. Which is exactly why you're going to see some of my gems have max health, despite the fact that I'm going to be referring you guys to having crit hit as the last stat. And that's just because my crystal gems allow me to do that. But those are the stats you're going to be going for the Empowered Gems. And then for 3 of the Lesser Gems, there's 6 colored Lesser Gems, not including the Cosmic Gems, right? And so I like to say go a 3/3 ratio. So I try to have 3 of my Lesser Gems be the same, 2 pearls physical, 1 pearl crit damage, no pearl crit hit. And then the other 3 Lesser Gems, I have 1 pearl swapped over to the crit damage. So instead we have 2 pearls crit damage, 1 pearl crit hit, or 1 pearl physical damage, and then no pearls into crit hit. Now, again, if you have variation in these pearls, it doesn't matter. Like, I have a gem right here that's got 3 pearls physical. I got one here that's got 3 pearls crit damage. I can pretty much kill everything in the entire game. So that little bit of coefficiency really doesn't make that much of a difference. And my point is that I'm just giving you guys a base value to work towards. But if you have any variation in that value, it's not going to be the end of the world, and you don't have to follow this specific setup of stats to the letter. And that's basically going to do it. So hopefully you ended up finding this video helpful. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments. But otherwise, I hope you ended up finding this video helpful. And if you did, smash the like, sub for more, buy the merch you want, support the channel, and have a wonderful day, everybody.